Hey there, welcome to the Snakebird podcast. My name's Josh.
And I'm Steve.
Together we invite you to join us
as we explore the mysteries of Scripture,
the realm of God,
and freedom through Christ.
So spread out your wings
and slither in place,
because this is Snakebird. Hey, welcome Snakebirds to another episode of the Snakebird podcast. We're in part 4 of our profile examining the biblical chronicle of the character of Abraham.
That's right, guys. We find ourselves again rolling along in the story of Abraham, and the story just keeps getting deeper and deeper as they do. And last episode, we finally reached the point where we could rightfully call Abram by his new name, Abraham, as well as Sarah from Sarai.
So freeing, right?
Yeah, it really was. And we saw that circumcision was instated for Abraham and every male under his roof as a sign for generations to come. And then we saw the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're all familiar with that, and the unfortunate loss of Lot's wife, sons-in-law, and the home that he had built there in Sodom. And now we approach chapter 21 of Genesis, where we'll finally get to see the birth of Abraham's first child who was promised. You know, there's Ishmael, and now there's Isaac, but this is, this is finally culminating to that final anticipation we've been looking at.
The one that we've been waiting for,
yes.
The one that God said, hey, out of Sarah is going to come a son. And Abram's like, dude, time's ticking.
Yeah.
I'm 99 years old.
Exactly. Yeah. And Isaac finally arrives, and he's actually, we see 100 years old when Isaac is born.
Yeah.
So that's old.
That's not making a baby age.
No, it is here. And while there's no doubt many bumps and bruises on the way to this promise, we see that the wait on God's timing was well worth it. And even Sarah, who once laughed in doubt at the thought of having a child in her old age, is now laughing in joy and in gratitude. As she even says in verse 6, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And it's so cool because it shows the power of God and the miraculous events that come from waiting on him.
Yeah, and that laughter that she's talking about, that's what Isaac's name is.
That's right.
Isaac means laughter. So if you're out there and you are named Isaac, or if you know somebody named Isaac, you can laugh along with them.
Yeah. Laugh at them hysterically as they look at you strangely.
Yeah. It's in the Bible. Check it out.
And that's a really cool thing. At the end of this, my takeaway point is really centered on that.
Oh, okay.
On that with Sarah and the laughter. So, but while the previous and long anticipated event of Isaac's birth just unfolded, we're coming also to a very sobering scene where we see that God opens doors in one hand, but he can shut them in another, and we're going to see kind of that situation with Ishmael here. Mm-hmm. He was, back in chapter 16:12, we learned that he would be a wild donkey of a man that would be at odds with everyone around him, and his prophesied nature is coming to fruition. And Sarah sees the mocking, and she's not having it. She tells Abraham that he's got to go with his mother. Yeah.
So the story is that Isaac is born, and he has weaned. And at the end of his weaning, Abraham is celebrating because I believe that it speaks of a transference into a new phase where it's like he's no longer a baby. Scholars debate on how old he is at this point. Some say that he's pretty young still, maybe 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that Ishmael is 13 years older, so he's probably around 17-ish.
Yeah.
And he's just straight up mad dogging him. He's mocking him, and it'd be tough to have a little brother who, little half brother in a sense, because, while he's still Abraham's kids, they're both Abraham's kids. One's mother is Sarah, Abraham's wife, and another one is Hagar, the bondwoman, the Egyptian. And so clearly there might be some division there, and he's giving him the runaround.
That's true. And I mean, to think about the climate he had to grow up in with that hanging over his head, because everybody knew, they had a big following of people that traveled with him and whatnot. Everybody always probably looked at Ishmael as this wasn't the right one. Mm-hmm. And that probably didn't help in the way he acted. Yeah. And like you said, he was kind of mocking.
Yeah.
That's what the Bible says he was doing.
He was scoffing and
And it had to be terribly hard for Abraham because Ishmael, like you said, he was his son. He had grown up alongside Abraham, no doubt developed those precious father-son memories, and Abraham had to have cherished him. And this is a hard thing, but now the painful consequences of that disobedience has reared its ugly head, because God told Abraham to obey the request of Sarah now, in letting them go.
Yeah.
Which had to be hard.
Yeah, she sees Ishmael mocking her son across the room. She comes to Abraham and she goes, we got to do something about it.
Yeah.
And God, in turn, says, you need to honor what your wife asks. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I mean, for 17 years of his life, he's like, this is my boy. And it said that it really displeased him. It really bummed him out.
Yeah.
And God said to Abraham, don't let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will make a nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. And so God reaffirms the promise. He's like, I haven't forgotten him. And Abraham rose early in the morning and he took some bread and he took a skin of water and he said, here you go.
Yeah.
And he kind of said, there's the door.
Yeah. Well, and I love how God's faithful. And last time this happened, she ran away, and the angel sent her back. Mm-hmm. And this time, God's saying, "Well, now my timing is saying she is going." Mm-hmm. But as we're going to see next, he comes through again in another way that's kind of like it happened last time. Because to make the scene sadder, we see that as they leave, Hagar comes to a point where they've run out of resources, it seems, and she puts Ishmael a couple 100 feet away under a tree so she doesn't have to see up close what it looks like for her boy to die. And that's super sad. But just like last time with the pregnancy, an angel comes and reaffirms, hey, we're still keeping this promise with him too. Mm-hmm. And I found that really, really cool that God's timing last time said stay, now it says go, but still, I'm watching out for you.
Yeah. And you know, I was reading a few different things, and it talks about the resources that Abraham could have and why he didn't send caravans full of food and water while he gave him just bread and a wineskin of water. What was the purpose behind that? And some of the debate I saw was that possibly Abraham said, well, God, I tried to help you out beforehand, and now you're just saying that they're going to survive. I need to believe in that by faith, and so I'm intentionally not going to try to help you out by saying, hey, I'm going to let them go, and you're going to take care of them. You're going to be their sufficiency.
I could see it, yeah.
And so, I mean,
unless he's being a super hard dad and say it builds character.
I don't know.
That makes sense.
But you were saying that the angel that reaches out to her, it's another possibly appearance of the angel of God, which is a Christophany.
Which is so cool to see these appearances.
Yes.
Makes me wonder how much he roamed around.
I know. Yeah, because, I mean, it says that he heard from heaven, but still, Jesus is there, scattered throughout the Old Testament. Yeah. And that's really awesome. And even then, he reaffirms his promise to her about Ishmael, and he says, I'm going to make a great nation out of him. And he says, lift up your head and open your eyes. And she sees a well, and he's like, you don't have to go thirsty.
Yeah. A well appears before them, and he makes a way for them all the way to the wilderness of Paran, we're told. And we see that Ishmael did grow up and became an archer and eventually took an Egyptian wife. And all of that did come true. God kept his word and was faithful even to Ishmael, the son born from disobedience.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed in the Bible that God often bypasses the firstborn for the secondborn?
I've noticed a few cases.
Yeah, there's several.
Joseph's sons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a few different.
Yeah.
More profiles to come.
Yeah.
Hopefully not part 5s, but
the 5-parters.
This was a big one, but
Jacob and Esau, Cain and Abel.
Yeah, there's quite a few instances.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Then to close the chapter, we see that Abraham revisits his old acquaintance, King Abimelech, doesn't he?
Yes. And his captain of the guard, Pichol.
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 Like
yeah, that's how the Strong's G25. That's how the guy he says it. He says Pichol. Pichol.
Nice.
So, which his name means strong or mouth of all or ruling all. So I thought that was interesting.
That's cool. I'm always glad that you bring the names meanings because I always forget to look at some of that.
I tried to. There's a few in the later chapters that I haven't gotten to yet. So.
Well, we do see that Abimelech has clearly over the years noticed how greatly God has blessed Abraham, and he was moved to approach him with a proposition in which he reminds Abraham that he so graciously gave him any portion of the land in his region. And here we sit all these years later where Abraham is walking in high cotton, and Abimelech's like, you know what, we should strike a deal.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And he suggests a covenant of peace between him and Abraham. And Abraham has some small print before he'll agree to it. He's like, yeah, well, there's this well.
Yeah.
He's like, I'd love to do that, but we got a dispute on a well over here, and I don't really like that. So we need to make some things squared away before we'll go through with this.
Did he say... Well,
nice. But yeah, I just found it kind of funny when I read this part.
Yeah.
It's like a businessman type of deal.
Definitely. Yeah, and I love that when Abimelech even approaches him originally, he says, God is with you in all that you do. Mm-hmm. And just the acknowledgement of the people around Abraham witnessing that God is with them, and he's in all of his dealings, and he's in the way that he's protecting him, and he's establishing him. And I mean, to think of that, could somebody say that about us, you or me, or you listener, God is with you in all that you do. I think of Joseph, even in the hardest of times, even in prison, even in Potiphar's household, yet everything that he touched because of God's Spirit upon him seemed to succeed.
Yeah, that's some good application, because we have to remember that the world, a lot of times we don't think anybody's really paying attention. They think we're a dorky Christian, but that's actually not true. The world's watching us.
Yeah. And
to see Abimelech had been watching Abraham and his movements and how he really conducted himself and all of that. So that's good to point out.
And maybe the deception of a couple chapters ago.
Well, yeah. Well, and he saw he was human.
Maybe that's worn away a little bit.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Because there's the human factor too. The world knows that, I don't know if they do or not, but we're human and we stumble.
Well, and we're real.
And if you're honest, you'll see that in anybody, no matter what side of the fence you're on.
Yeah, because we'd rather be real than be Pharisees.
Exactly.
Like Pharisees are like, I've never sinned, I've never stepped in poop, I've never done anything, and they look and they're like, my robes are always white. Whereas Christians, if they're being real, they should say, I've sinned. I've fallen short. And yet it's God who's made me clean, God who's changed my life, all those things.
Yes, very true.
And so, they talk about this well. And Abimelech's like, I usually know what's going on in my land. I've never heard of this.
Yeah. We said, what's going on? we got to get it settled. We got to get it settled before we bring out the ewe lambs.
Yeah.
And so they do.
Yeah.
They after a ceremony and a trading of ewe lambs had taken place, Abraham and Abimelech struck an understanding of one another, you might say.
Yeah. And the Hebrew word to swear means to bind by 7 things. And so they bring out these 7 ewe lambs. And the word 7 is Saba, and the word swear is Seba. So it's like a Seba Saba.
Nice.
Yeah.
Saba as in Sabbath. 7.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
They did exactly what Abraham and God did, except both parties participated this time because they do the cutting, the covenant.
Yeah.
Where they slice the animals in half and then walk in between them with the intention of saying, hey, if either of us break this covenant, may this, what's going on either side of us, happen to the person that breaks the covenant.
May you be halved.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Ooh. And they call the place Beersheba. which means well of the sevenfold oath.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, to this day, doesn't it say? It's pretty neat.
Yeah. Which the author at that time is like, oh yeah, it's still there.
Yeah, letting the readers know this is something that it's been passed down.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. And then the last thing we see in chapter 21 is that Abraham plants a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, this place we just discussed, and calls on the name of God, and dwelled in the land of the Philistines for several days, it says. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the meaning behind the tamarisk tree is, but I'm sure there's something cool to be discovered there. I didn't have time to get into that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I read something about it, but I don't quite remember, and I wish I had gone back and done more with that. But I do appreciate that as much as Abraham moves around, he is still setting up these places to remember, and I feel like it's another thing to anchor his worship of God in.
Yeah, like a landmark to look back on.
Yeah.
Something that'll, in later years, he can look on and see as it grows, remember that spot.
Yes, for sure.
That's what I would have done. And then, so that's the close of chapter 21, and we're getting into chapter 22, where we're going to see, this is a really heavy-hitting chapter because we see some things that are confusing at first, but now with hindsight, it's pretty evident that this chapter points to some very prophetic things. Mm-hmm. And there's a scene in this chapter, and it's the only scene identified in the New Testament as a type of Christ in both his death and resurrection, which is found in Hebrews 11:17 through 19, and we're going to get to that probably a couple different times. Mm-hmm. But before we do, I would like to note the importance of this chapter in even the Orthodox Jewish circles who don't even believe Jesus is the Messiah. But it's an age-old Jewish tradition that this chapter is reflected on and read on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year festival. And the reason is because of Abraham's binding of Isaac. It became the ultimate example of faithful obedience and self-sacrifice to God. So any way you slice it, this chapter is one of great importance.
Yes. Yeah, and if you would allow me, I would also like to point out that Isaac is a wonderful type of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Because just even looking at their stories, both were specifically promised sons.
Yes.
Both were born after a period of delay.
Yep.
Both mothers were assured by God's omnipotence. They were visited and said, you're going to have a son. Both were given names rich with meaning before they were born.
By God.
Yes, by God. And one's like, his name shall be called Jesus. And the other one said, you shall call him Isaac. Both births occurred at God's appointed time. Both births were miraculous, and then both births were accompanied by joy. And so that's clearly not the only parallels that we're going to see between Isaac and Jesus, but just going back even to the birth of Isaac, there's so many types of parallels that we can find between him and Jesus, especially as we rush into this just cornerstone chapter.
And also, Isaac was referred to as the object of Abraham's love, and Jesus too was considered the object of his father's love in Matthew 3 and Luke 3.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. A lot of connections to be made. And like you said, there's a lot more that we could get into. We'll probably touch on them as we go.
Yeah, because 22 is a powerhouse chapter.
It really is. So, verse 1. We immediately see that God calls out to Abraham, and Abraham's response was, "Here I am," which is an answer that we continue to see Abraham give throughout this portion of the story. It's kind of a unique answer that he is kind of unique to chapter 22.
Yeah.
And one commentator notes that the answer Abraham gives, "Here I am," is not one stating his mere presence, but a statement of availability. So the idea is, yes, Lord, I'm listening and prepared to do whatever it is you're about to ask me to do. It's a response seen throughout Scripture in characters like Moses, Samuel, and Isaiah. And Abraham is ready to do whatever comes after this answer from God. And to say it is a tall order would be an understatement.
Yeah.
what's coming.
That's funny because it's exactly almost what I had in my notes. Because I was like Isaiah, Samuel, and countless others throughout church history indicating their obedience to the highest order, saying, I'm available.
Yeah.
It's not just a present, it's a, what do you need from me?
Who shall go for us? Here I am, Lord, send me.
Yes, exactly.
It's this character type we see in these men of great faith.
Yeah. I see it as like the, here's a line in the sand. If you're willing to step forward, and take on the mantle, take on the responsibility, step over this line. And I could just see Abraham at every time going, he's jumping right over that barrier saying, I'm available.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
And as we go, did you have anything else, Josh?
I wanted to point out that in verse 1 of chapter 22, at least in the New King James Version, it says, Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, and that's when he said, Here I am. And this testing is going to reveal a lot of things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about these tests because this was not a test to produce faith, but like I just said, it's a test to reveal faith. God had been building up Abraham for a while for this test, basically his whole walk with him. And it's wild because this test really seemed to contradict a previous promise that he'd made because as we look at it, he'd already promised in Isaac, your seed shall be called.
Yes.
And so you're going, okay, where's this coming from?
Yeah.
But I appreciate, and just to get into a little application just as we get rolling, God only tests us when we're ready for that specific test. Like he wouldn't be taking a day one believer and going, I'd like to call you to do something right here.
Yeah. You don't send the preschoolers to learn calculus.
Yes, exactly. And so I feel like there's so much hope in God saying, hey, I'm only going to give you what I know you can handle and what I believe that you can pull through with.
Yes.
And for Abraham, he'd been enrolled in the school of faith for a long time. You think about the family test originally where it was like, hey, come out of Ur of the Chaldees, leave your family. And then he had the famine test.
Yeah.
And we see what happened in the Negev. And then he had the fellowship test with Lot and the land. And he's like, choose the best thing. And then he had the fight test. And he had to go and raise his warriors and go out and save Lot. And then he had the fortune test where the king of Sodom was like, take it all. Just give me the people.
Yeah.
And then he had the fatherhood test, which we know he failed because Ishmael.
Yep.
And then he had the farewell test, which he passed with a broken heart because he had to say goodbye to Ishmael and Hagar. And so now we've arrived at this new test. And I feel like that's what we're going through with God is a lot of times those tests are to reveal our faith, but they're also to perfect our faith, like James says. They're to produce in us more trust in him, like Peter says. And I think it's so neat. And this is a doozy for sure.
Yeah, it is. And I have a feeling as we get into the details of this test, it's brought up in multiple spots throughout chapter 22, so there's probably going to be some jumping ahead and going back and discussing some of these details. But I like that. It's the whole muscle must be torn to be built. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just read verses 2 through 3. Is that cool?
Absolutely.
All right. And this is God speaking. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and arose, and he went to the place of which God had told him. Okay, so you got questions, listener. I know. I do too. And as we study this and we go through this, we're going to answer, hopefully, most of those. So, but real quick, before we get into it, I want to take note of his response. It's instant obedience. And I said it was a tall order. That's a tall order.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just really think about what was just asked there. And I think back to his previous responses when God was promising to give Abraham Isaac, and Abraham was second-guessing God, it seemed, at every turn, even to the point when he tried to fast-track it with Ishmael. And here we see an instant obedience when God asked him to sacrifice his boy, this promised boy. And the reason I believe is that Abraham is a wiser man now than he was in those previous years where he doubted. His faith has grown. Like you said, it's been perfected more than it was. And I think Abraham knew God was up to something more than what it sounded like. And we're actually fixing to get into that in a minute. Just hang tight. But we have Abraham headed towards this mountain where he's going to do these things that were just asked. And I know I kind of want to stop for a minute and discuss some prophecy stuff here, but Josh, you got anything?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, because some people just brought this out of left field, saying human sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's kind of unheard of with God so far, and it's not unheard of with the pagan gods of the area.
Yes.
And so it's like, where are we going with this? And of course, stay with us, because God's going to give himself an opportunity to be set apart.
Yeah.
But just looking at this from the outside looking in, you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
Did you change? Because it escalated quickly.
True. And I saw some of that too. Some of the scholars are saying, well, this was a pagan practice and God was like, I'm talking to him on his level because he used to be a pagan. I don't think so. I've even seen some of these documentaries that Nat Geo comes out with and stuff, and it was like, well, the Bible actually was just a morphed pagan religion.
Oh my goodness.
They kind of take that road a lot, but that's not what's happening here. But just to go back for a second, we have Abraham headed towards this particular mountain in the land of Moriah, and I really just want to stop for a second and soak in some spine-tingling prophecy for me. Ancient historian Josephus refers to this particular mountain as the mountain Moriah, and confirms it to be the very mountain that King David / Solomon's temple was built on. I saw that in numerous spots. But currently, that's going to be the 37-acre tract of land where the Temple Mount sits. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard in the past it's the most coveted piece of property on planet Earth. And it would also place this area in the exact region where Jesus was crucified. Some would even say the exact spot that Jesus was crucified. I don't know. I think it might have been. I don't know.
I do too.
I really do.
Yeah.
But you want to talk about premeditation? God's plan for redemption is so evident to see throughout history. I really don't know what to say to skeptics. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Yes.
With the greatest talent in story writing today, much less with people writing on animal skins and papyrus 4,000 years ago. This history of Mount Moriah to Jesus and those connections, I get goosebumps every time I even think about it.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
It really is.
And considering that Moriah means foreseen of Jehovah. And so,
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
The cherry on top.
It's foreshadowing.
Crazy.
I mean, this whole chapter, and I hope you already know the story of the chapter. And if you don't, then just hang with us, because we're going to reveal all of it. But this whole chapter is virtually God calling his shot 2,000 years into the future.
Yeah, for real. And to take him to that spot where Jesus was going to be crucified, and then to do what we're fixing to see, it's fantastic.
Yes.
So, anyway, that's all I wanted to park on for that little portion. And the next thing I had is Abraham, the servants, and Isaac. They get to a place as they're traveling there to this Mount Moriah, or mountains in the land of Moriah, and they see off in the distance the spot. The spot. And Abraham tells his servants to wait there because him and the boy are going to worship. And yet again, it's very interesting that he says they will be back. Abraham says him and the boy will be back. And if he knows that he's going to kill Isaac, he obviously wouldn't be coming back with him. So we've got that in play. Unless, of course, he thought that he would be raised from the dead, which would take us to Hebrews 11:19.
Yeah.
So, And I'll just go ahead and read that real quick. He, speaking of Abraham, considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, which he also received him back as a type. And from what I gathered from the scholars, this speaks to Abraham believing something along the lines of Isaac being resurrected as a symbol or type. I do have a little bit more on that in a minute, but it seems to me that Abraham truly believed what he told the servants, that they were going to come back.
Yeah. Yeah, and okay, to speak to just a couple of verses ago where he had to get the donkey saddled and he had to get the wood cut, I feel like Abraham did that himself, going, okay, God has given me specific instructions. I'm acting on those. I'm probably a nervous mess because of the edict he's given me. And yet Abraham is following through in obedience. And then as they're heading to Mount Moriah, as you said, it says, then on the third day.
Yeah.
And again, if you're anything in the Bible, your bells are going off going, this sounds more like another Jesus tie-in.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden they've arrived at this place of the skull, Golgotha, very same similar area. And I love the fact that, even I think it is the New King James Version says, the boy and I are going to go yonder to worship.
I love that word. Out yonder.
Yeah, we're gonna go to worship, but we're gonna come back. And he loads Isaac up with the wood. And he says, here, carry this. And yet Abraham is carrying the fire and the knife. And this is what Spurgeon says. Spurgeon said, Abraham took the knife up the hill. He didn't leave it behind or claim to forget it. That knife was cutting into his own heart all the while, yet he took it. Unbelief would have left the knife at home, but genuine faith takes it.
Wow.
Because there it was. And not only was it going to be the object of Isaac's demise, it was at that moment the object of Abraham's destruction. I mean, it was killing him.
Yeah, that's true. And Isaac bearing the wood of his sacrifice, just like Jesus.
Yes, which I have more on.
In a minute. Yeah.
But of course, Isaac looks around and he goes, well, we've got wood and fire.
Yeah. And real quick, too, just as you were talking about this, it popped in my head. Some people talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, where you make it happen so that people look back on it. This stuff right here, the third day, all of that was recorded by secular histories about the third day and stuff with Jesus in some cases. And then we have, none of that could be self-fulfilling. So this is tangible, miraculous prophecy here.
Yes.
Because this was written way before, 2,000 years before that. Mm-hmm. And then, so anyway, that's really cool.
Yeah, you're saying it's not like circular fulfillment.
Well, sometimes, and we talked about this with Jesus being a legend or somebody that tried, like, say he recognized that, hey, I was born in the right tribe, let me ride this and make these things happen that I know I can make happen. Mm-hmm. You can't do that with some of this. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so Isaac again says, we got all this, where's the offering? And I love Abraham says, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Or if you're a King James Version reader, it says, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of pastors that are like, it doesn't have to say much more than that because it's really literally saying it right there, know? So I thought that was really cool.
I did find something on that. God will provide here. I did see some debate also on the translation. Some scholars were saying the problem with Abraham saying God will provide would contradict the idea that Abraham anticipated a resurrection of Isaac, or insinuate that he was telling him a lie in order to evade telling him what was fixing to happen. Some scholars say that the literal translation would be God is providing the lamb, meaning Isaac, we're headed up the mountain with the sacrifice God is providing, as in it's you. So I saw that some scholars said that was the proper translation. I kind of, in my mind, my only thing with that is I didn't find other instances where that worked with that word, Hebrew word. But anyway, that is some. I think the message either way is not compromised at all with either translation.
Yeah.
But I saw some of that too, and I did see something else too. If you don't mind me going back for a second. one thing I noticed again is this response of Abraham saying, "Here I am," when Isaac asks him what's going on, except this time he's not answering God, he's answering his son. And for me, I'm getting the feeling that Abraham knows that this is going to be the biggest test ever laid upon him. And he's committed himself in obedience in such a way that he's set his face like flint, not looking to the left or right, just like this 1,000-mile stare. He's just like, he's headed towards this task. And sometimes this is all we as believers can do when we're facing the biggest giant tests of our lives. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing the process. We just have to keep moving forward with a complete childlike trust that God is going to provide, whatever that provision may look like. And that's precisely what God does here. In all senses of the translation of the Hebrew word, he provides.
Yes. Yeah. The next thing is they get to the spot, and they came to the place where God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood.
Yeah.
And again, when you think about how old Isaac would have to be, this is like 25 to 30 years after the last chapter. So Isaac, a lot of scholars believe that he's in his early 30s at this point. Yeah.
Oh, I saw some that said a lot younger than that, but I saw that he was definitely of the age where he could fight back and get away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just say that it's 25 years. Let's say that it's 30 years. Let's say that it's even less. No matter what, teenage, adolescent or teenager, he could still be like, Dad, I'm not letting you put the ropes on me.
Yeah.
And then load me up onto this altar. This is weird. You've taught me all these times on how to make a sacrifice. Where's the animal?
Yeah. Well, and Abraham's in his hundreds. So, I mean, that it wouldn't be hard for him to fight back. And he was likely terrified, but Isaac didn't fight back from what we can gather. He was willing, and which speaks, to a lot, right?
The parallels, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's something I noticed too. That's really cool and terrifying at the same time.
Very.
Just this whole test.
Yes.
All right, so shall we read verses 10 through 12, Josh?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. There it is again. He said, Do not stretch your hand out against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And we see that behind Abraham is a ram caught in the thicket, and it was put there in place of Isaac to be sacrificed. I have a few things that I'd like to talk about there, Josh. But what are you seeing?
Oh, I love the faith. I mean, to be a fly on the rock there, just to watch how this all went down, because it's hard to. To me, it's hard to dramatize it in my mind as I read it out loud. And the more that I read it over and over again, the more I try to get a real picture and a real sense of what it was like, of the anguish that he would have as he's holding that knife, as he's raising it, as he's still doing it by faith, going, hey, if this plunges down, I still believe that my son is walking down this mountain with me in one way or another, that God has shown himself so faithful that he is going to raise him back up from the dead. Yeah. And I just love that, again, that angel of the Lord seems to imply that it's actually Jesus there saying, hey, you hold back. We see that you trust us. We see that you're with us and you don't have to go through with this. And just that last second salvation, that last second intervention.
Yes. Very cool.
And I also wanted to mention on when you said verse 13, and Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And I love the fact that from this point, he named this little hill that they're on Mount Provision, which is named after this new name that he has for God, which is Jehovah Jireh. God will provide, my provider. And I find that such a comforting name, considering the context that it's in, because I know we've got all these parallels and we keep mentioning them and we kind of give you glimpses of them, but I have a whole list that we're going to talk about, and you probably do too towards the end of this. But God will provide. And that's what he does 2,000 years later. When we need a hero, we need a substitute to stand in the gap for our sin that we could never pay for. He provided that. And it's so cool that even Isaac going, Dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham being able to say without a shadow of a doubt, God's going to give something. He's got it waiting in the wings. And I feel like we need to be cautious on how we use that term, Jehovah Jireh. Yes,
I agree. It's something that's really struck a chord in my heart is people using that to say, if you work hard enough, God's going to bless you with things and stuff. God will provide you with tangible things. And that this Jehovah Jireh is not speaking of that.
Yeah, it has that little connotation that the Lord helps those who help themselves, or,
But the provision here is the ultimate treasure that we could never compare to any of that.
Yeah.
He's provided Christ on. This is all prophetic. This was a window into the future. Earlier in the chapter, it gives us a sneak peek to this moment, and this moment's giving us a sneak peek to Jesus.
Yes, there is a pastor named Paul David Washer who has some very strong words on this. He said, please don't ever use those words out of context. Don't talk to me about a house that God gave you and say Jehovah Jireh. Don't talk to me about a new car you got and say Jehovah Jireh. That will infuriate me.
Yes.
Jehovah Jireh applies to a substitution and a redemption. He gave us a redeemer. He provided the lamb.
Yep.
Don't,
I love Pastor Washer's whole take on that.
Yeah, and
he said a few things about that.
There's times where there's things where I'm like, I have righteous indignation, and you get upset because you're like, you're taking something that is so precious to God and meant to be very holy in the context of like Jesus coming to die for our sins, and we don't want to turn that into like, I won the lottery or something silly like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's speaking of the sacrifice for us.
Yes,
so
God is our sufficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, we could carry on with this for days. It's such an important thing to see.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read verses 16 through 19. It contains some application that I saw. So here we go. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, this is God talking to Abraham, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies, and in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. And before I point out the application that I noticed, I'd like to real quick look at this word seed. We have been seeing these reoccurring affirmations of God's promise to Abraham, and the consistent thing we keep seeing is that Abraham will have many descendants of which will take possession of a region of land. But here we see something a little deeper prophetically, as one scholar notes the following. The usage of seed, quote unquote, appears to refer to an individual who will bless the whole world. This is evident in that the pronoun referring back to that seed is singular. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what he's pointing out here. It's kind of almost a play on words in English anyway, because you would think his seed, you're talking about all the nations. It's talking about to an individual within that descendant, you know. So I thought that was really cool. It's a post-Melchizedek form of Jesus Christ, is what I gathered.
Exactly.
Really cool.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting to mention that these are the last recorded words from God to Abraham here. He said, you passed the test.
Yeah.
And I'm going to reaffirm my promise to you once again. And I love that way earlier in the chapters, he had taken Abraham out in the vision and he said, look at the stars.
Yeah.
And he goes, okay. And then later on in another vision, he said, consider the sand. And now in this reaffirming of the promise, he goes, remember the sand and the stars.
Yeah.
And he just goes, I will bless you and I will multiply your descendants. And in your seed, all the nations shall be blessed, like you said, referring to Jesus.
Yeah.
So
really cool.
Yeah.
And then just real quick for some application that piqued my interest in verses 16 through 18. This really came out of left field on me, but it's something that stood out and I just had to mention it. So it's a topic we've danced around in a few different episodes, and the idea is that once saved, always saved if we abide. And I had mentioned this previously last episode, this balance of faith in God's saving work met with our work of obedience. And I find it very confirming that at every point where Abraham has accomplished a task of obedience, God keeps reaffirming his promise that's going to be fulfilled. And in verse 16, God says, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you. And so God, in a way, is saying, if you abide, this balance of faith and works, not that any of it is accomplished in our ability, but it's the obedience, no matter how silly the task of obedience may seem, is met with God's continued faithfulness that meets us even when we fail. This, I believe, is one of the most difficult concepts for us Christians to balance, and I've certainly gathered this by simply growing up and being exposed to so many different denominations where lines are drawn in the sand in almost a combative way. But being Snakebirds, balance being key, I felt that this was some pretty cool application of seeing he's abiding, if you abide, that type of thing. So I that came out of me pretty hard. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. So anyway, after this mountaintop experience, we see Abraham and Isaac return to the men who were waiting, and we're told that they returned to Beersheba, didn't they, Josh? Where they live.
Yeah, where Sarah goes, you did what?
Yeah, right. It said, huh?
Can I see that knife?
Yeah, I'm going to slit your throat.
Yeah. And then just the end of the chapter really more talks about Abraham's brother, Nahor. And I don't think we need to go into that because this is Abraham's profile. But yeah.
The genealogy we see, I did actually have two things about that that I thought were interesting.
Make me look like an idiot.
No.
I'm just kidding.
I know you are. But another out of left fielder here, this genealogy, it almost seems out of place at the end. For me, it did when I stumbled on it. But why on earth is this genealogy here? So I did look at the commentators, and one said that the thematic reason for this genealogy was to anticipate the death of Sarah, and in the mention of Rebekah, which revealed the unquestionable transition to the next matriarch and provide transparency of the continued viability of the Abrahamic covenant. A lot of big words there, but basically that was the thematic reason. And press rewind if you want to hear that again. But the theological reason would be the genealogy pointed to Abraham's righteous desire not to find a Canaanite wife for Isaac. And that's a whole nother part of the story. And honestly, next episode, when we tie all this up, we'll probably touch here and there, but Isaac's another profile.
Yeah.
So we'll be probably hop, skipping, jumping a few here's and there's. But anyway, I thought that was, because when I came across that, sometimes I go to spots in the Bible and you're like, why is this here? This doesn't make sense. It's like, why do mosquitoes exist? You come to these spots, but it is there for a reason.
It's like an old-timey news feed. There's like beep, 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 beep. Meanwhile, over in, in Abraham's brother's side of the things, let me tell you about a little girl named Rebecca who's coming up.
Exactly. It is there for a reason. And I thought I'd point out
definitely.
a thematic and theological reason that was there.
Yeah. Man, and she's got a brother that we will eventually talk about.
Nahor?
No.
No. Oh, no. Wrong character.
Yeah. Isn't his name Nabin? Oh, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll study that later.
Oh, my gosh. I've only been reading the Bible for half my life. Laban. Oh, man.
Yes. It was on the tip of my tongue. I was like, it sounds right, but it doesn't.
She's got a brother named Laban Laban.
Nahor was the one that my wife was going to call me, right? Like episode 2 of this.
Because he's a snorer?
He's the snorer.
Yeah, the mouth breather.
Yes, the mouth breather. That's right. I was way off.
Laban, yeah.
Yeah, he's a character, isn't he?
He really is. He's untrustworthy.
We'll get to that.
Yes.
Okay, I've got some takeaway for me, and I know you probably too.
I do as well, yes.
Okay. Why don't you take it, Josh?
Okay. There's so many things to talk about. First and foremost, I just want to talk about a few more of the parallels between Isaac and Jesus and this whole story about how, to me, it really is a precursor to the crucifixion. It's a precursor to what God wanted to show. And we find that so often in the Old Testament, that the Old Testament is a picture of a New Testament principle. And so a few more correlations or a few more parallels is that the Father and the Son acted together. Because more than 2 times in the narrative, it says they went, both of them, together. And so you're speaking of Abraham and Isaac side by side, walking into this agreement together, walking into this situation together. And then it also says another parallel is that the son had to die, that there was going to be a sacrifice. And Isaac goes, "Where's the lamb?" And then you fast forward 2,000 years later, and you see John the Baptist going, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the whole world," in John 1:29. And then the Son bore the burden of sin. The wood here is mentioned 5 times in this story, and Isaac didn't start carrying the wood until he arrived at Mount Moriah. The wood is not a picture of the cross, for Jesus did not carry his cross all the way to Calvary. Instead, the wood seems to be a picture of the burden of sin that Jesus bore for us, because it says Abraham took the wood and laid it upon Isaac his son. And then we see in Isaiah 53:6, it says, "The Lord has laid upon him," that's Jesus, "the iniquity of us all." And then the last thing I'll say is that the son was raised from the dead. For Isaac, it was figuratively. Jesus said, "Stop, don't kill him." And then next thing you know, here comes, in newness of life, Isaac walking down the mountain. But for Jesus, it was literal. He faced that sacrifice. And I love that God knew it wouldn't be righteous for Abraham to slay his son. That he wasn't about human sacrifice. That's not the point. And the pagan people around Abraham would have been like, "Oh, well, who is your God?" Because that doesn't represent him. But Jesus and God had worked this plan of redemption out years in the making after Adam and Eve fell. And so this plan was in place. And I just love that this picture is there for hopefully Jewish people to see. As you talked about this being recognized in Rosh Hashanah, I pray that when the veil is lifted, that maybe they'll have those goosebump moments like we have, going, "Oh my gosh, that picture's there." And Father Abraham and his son Isaac were, in a sense, putting on a theatrical display of what would come between God the Father and Jesus Christ on the cross, on Golgotha, on Calvary.
And it's funny how people automatically take it to those things about was this human sacrifice? But you ever think about maybe that was there for a future reader? Like there's prophecies that says close up the book and for a further generation. I think that's what that was. It was never about human sacrifice. It was about Jesus.
Yes. And okay, so that ties in just to another snippet of application that I have, is that God might ask you by faith to do something that seems out of the normal, just like he did here with Abraham. But look what it signified in the long run. So maybe he's asking you to do something, and I don't know what it might be, but are we going to act like Abraham did and obey by faith? Or are we going to try to make excuses? Or are we going to try to bargain with God? Well, I don't need to do that. Maybe I can do this. I don't know what that looks like in our lives. Maybe it's just reading our Bible at our lunch break in the break room at work. Maybe it's sending somebody a card with the gospel written out in it. Maybe it's just saying to somebody, Jesus loves you. There's a lot of different out-of-the-box ideas that God might put on our heart, and we have to have the faith to be open to them and to put those things into motion, because otherwise there's an opportunity that you may not even know that you're going to have for a person to miss.
That's so true. That fits perfectly into my application.
Oh, okay. Well, take it away, please.
I was going to go back and highlight some of that. You did such a good job with that I'm going to skip that and jump straight into that segue. When I read the portion of Scripture in chapter 21:6, where Sarah had changed her laughter of doubt into laughter of joy and amazement from the miracle of having Isaac at 90, I couldn't help but think of a moment that's frozen in my own memory where I too laughed at the idea that God would do something in my life. And I would like to share this testimony here for any ears out there that might be moved by it in my own life. So when I was about 28 years old, I had an experience with God that started to change me. And these changes took effect over the next couple of years. My wife took notice of them, but I still had some limitations in my own head of what exactly God was doing. And I vividly remember this one night where I was talking with Vanessa about God's Word, and she looked at me and smiled, and she said, "Someday you're going to preach." And I remember literally laughing out loud. And I told her it was a ridiculous idea because of certain factors in my life, including the public speaking was a huge fear for me, and there's some other things too. And she just smiled and she said it again, "Someday you're going to preach." And fast forward about 2 years later, I find myself at a very small church that had been praying for another servant. I had been praying for a true family in Christ. And less than a year later, I found myself in the bathroom of that same church, looking myself in the mirror, completely terrified because I was fixing to preach a sermon behind the pulpit. And I asked God in that moment, "Lord, whatever happens in the next hour, I give it to you." And I admitted there was simply nothing at that moment that I could offer except for complete surrender of my vessel for His use. And then I flushed the toilet, so if someone was waiting on me, they thought I was actually in there for the right reason. And then I proceeded to watch a sermon come forth from my lips as I tuned in and out of my own thoughts, and before I knew it, the closing prayer had come. And after that sermon, I was approached by several brothers and sisters. They said they were moved by it and gave me some kind words. And over the next month, that sermon accumulated over 1,600 listens on the church's podcast platform, where the average listen was about 50. And before I go any further, I want to make it very clear that I'm not bragging here. Because listener, if you knew me, the real me, the person I am outside of Christ, you would know that I could never have pulled any of that off. But looking back on this moment, all these years later, God has finally revealed to me what He did in that sermon in my life, and also that era of my life. I thought I was being called to be a pulpit minister after that first sermon. But as the years have passed, it's very clear what God did in that moment in my life. And He was telling me from that moment 2 years prior, where I laughed at the idea that I can never be used as a preacher, God was telling me, "Don't you ever doubt me again. Don't you ever doubt my ability to accomplish my will in whoever I choose to use." And guys, I've shared this sermon in detail with a couple of people, and it honestly didn't mean much to them. But looking back on this situation, I'm brought to tears because I know how powerful God is, regardless of my doubts and who I am or who I could be in Him. So, listener, this is my encouragement to you. If you're having any doubts in your life that seem too big for God, then know this: He is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his power that is at work within us. And don't laugh at the impossibility like Sarah did, like I did. Reach for God and he will exalt you for his glory. And so I just wanted to share that testimony because it was something that meant a lot for me. It was a miracle in my life. And I saw it in Sarah in that portion where she laughed. And then later that laughter turned into joy.
It got real.
It did.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I'm glad that you shared that. Yeah, there's just so much in Abraham's life, and we are so close to being done.
Yeah.
I think we need one more part because we're already at another good, I believe, stopping point. And so bear with us. The next one we will definitely finish. And we're going to gather the last glimpses of his life in the Old Testament and then flash forward to some of the mentions of his impact in the New Testament and really just summarize everything that we can glean from him and talk about, man, what a huge profile and impact he's been.
And we promise we will wrap it up the next one.
Yeah. And so
I think on the first episode we were discussing if it was going to be a 2 or 3-parter.
Yeah. My, how we've aged since then.
Yeah. Things have evolved. I was asking Josh earlier, I was like, when we did David, we did that in 2 episodes. Like, what were we thinking when we said 2 episodes for this guy?
I said we were very green because we probably didn't drill down as much as we did, especially with a character like Abraham.
Yeah, but I'm glad we're doing it, and I hope that you're remaining uplifted and seeing all of the application that we're gathering from his life, and we're glad that you guys are with us and hanging with us.
Yeah, and so please, if you have any characters that you want profiled, and probably more in like a 1 or 2-parter for sure, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We'd appreciate you sending us a message on Facebook. You can send one directly, or you can even comment on our page, or you can email us directly at connect@basnakebird.com. And we just love for you to join the conversation and be part of the community.
Yeah. And guys, if you find it in your heart, share us, subscribe, like, whatever. If you leave us a review and a 5-star rating on your podcast platform, the algorithms pushes the podcast out there to more ears. It's about the gospel. We keep saying that. We don't want to sound all trendy and like, share, and subscribe, but it would mean a lot to the show if you could just take that little extra time and do that.
Yes, it goes a long way. So we really appreciate you guys listening, and we want you to always remember, whatever you do,
wherever you go,
no matter what life throws at you,
it's never been a better time to follow the words of Jesus.
And be a snakebird.
As a sign for many... Man, I wrote this real jacked up. Golly. I must have been high on Pepto-Bismol or something when I did this. Let me see. I put finale instead of finally. Oh. And then I just stopped that sentence. Cool. Okay. And that's a really cool thing. At the end of this, my my takeaway point is really centered on that.
Oh, okay.
On that with Sarah and the laughter. So
holy laughing.
Yeah. Well, not that. But oh, that's funny.
I thought you were like, yeah.
Yeah, I agreed with it for a second. Yeah, just flow with it. So any way you slice it, this chapter is one of great importance. Dumb.
And be a snakebird. Oh my gosh, I said snakebird.